All right, good. Let's see if we can make this all work, modern technology that it is. Okay, so thank you very much for coming along to our December meetup. I'm going to get into it, don't want to hang around. So unlike our usual meetup where we'll talk a bit about what's new in Azure since our last meetup and then have a guest speaker, this evening is really about looking back over the last year since January and just doing a quick overview of what's gone on this year in Azure globally, not just specifically in Australia. I'll try and be brief. If I am dragging on, feel free to put your hand up and tell me to either hurry up or to shut up. We'll do the draw for the Xbox after we've had beer and pizza afterwards. So the pizza should be here about 18:45. There are beers at the back if you want to grab some, and I have some cool T-shirts to give away. Unfortunately, I have two larges, a small. Actually, no, an XL, two larges, and a medium to give away. So, you know, they may not fit all of us, but maybe your kids will like them, or you can use them to clean the car, your choice. The year overview, I did want to talk about next year just a little bit in relation to this user group. So Stefan Budo, who's sitting down here in the front, and working, I guess, through most of this year to try and find ways to broaden access to user groups, so we're not just running in one place once a month. So Stefan's been working hard and we've found a location. So the goal is that we'll run a North Shore meetup in February. It'll be at the Hunter-Gatherer. We don't have a date yet or content, but the good news is that because you're here and you're on our meetup site, you'll get notifications of when that event's scheduled, because we're going to use the same meetup site to coordinate these two groups. It doesn't make much sense to try and split the groups, and we've already got almost 2,500 people registered on this meetup, so it makes sense to do that. So keep an eye out for that. This meetup will still continue to run. Stefan typically will probably focus more on IT prototype content, so more infrastructure, virtual machine content, and I'll focus probably a little bit more on the developer side of things. But we'll play it by ear. At the end of the day, hopefully we'll have enough content to be able to run both groups fairly regularly, and we'll see how we go. But that's the goal. We've been trying to do that for most of this year, so it's good to see that we're for next year. So keep an eye out for that. All right. So unfortunately, it was 2015. I thought it was 2017. It's been a while since I watched Back to the Future, but really what I wanted to do was to travel back in time to the start of the year review. I'm not going to do in-depth month by month because we'd probably be here for quite some time going through the 200 plus this year for Azure. But really what I wanted to talk about was kind of the high level through each of the couple of months at a time, just to kind of give us a feel for some things, and maybe there's something that you don't know about because you haven't been following through the year what's been going on in Azure. ASR, I'm being very bad here. I don't define what ASR stands for, but Azure Site Recovery, back in January, beginning of the year, Microsoft announced that it would be able to protect Citrix desktop and XenApp environments hosted in Azure. If you're not using ASR and you're doing backups, you probably should be having a look at it, particularly if you're hosting workloads either in a hybrid scenario or in Azure. Database, which is kind of one of those key PaaS workloads that's been in Azure for forever. The guys have worked hard through the year to improve performance and give you more options to host larger databases with more demanding workload styles. So right back at the very beginning of the year, there was some announcements around boosts to the read-write performance of Azure SQL Database. I know customers of mine have challenges in that space quite often where they'll hit performance thresholds because the DTUs they don't have access to are broad enough, and we'll see later in the year that Microsoft's been making efforts to improve that for people. Open source track that Microsoft's been focusing heavily on. They've broadened the number of distributions that are available, either pre-configured as images or that are offered as supported through Microsoft and or partners. And back at the beginning of the year, ClearOS was one of those that was offered. Again, like Azure SQL Database, kind of one of the core long-term services in Azure. Back in the beginning of the year, they increased the maximum size for an individual blob to almost 5 terabytes, which is pretty phenomenal when you think about how many 5 terabyte files you could write on your local computer, which is not many. File storage encryption, so that's a big one, particularly if you work in FSI or government. You like to encrypt everything everywhere because it just gives you that warm and fuzzy feeling. So Microsoft addressed the ability to do Azure file storage encryption. So that's at the actual Azure files level. That's not down at the storage account level. Storage accounts already had the ability to do encryption. This is up at the actual file share, SMB share level we're talking about here. And the first attack at VMs and storage prices for the year happened all the way back at the start of the year. So Microsoft's stated standpoint is that they will, where possible, be price neutral with equivalent offerings in AWS. So anytime you see a move in price on AWS, you'll see an equivalent move in price on Azure as well for that. Suspect someone might be stuck in the lift. Never mind. Maybe they can come and join us and have a beer. A big part of going to something like Azure SQL Database is the removal of having to do a lot of IT busy work around keeping servers patched and alive and backed up. When you start up a new Azure SQL Database instance, you get a nice backup every 5 minutes out of the box with nothing configured for that. Microsoft's kind of gone back down the stack and introduced similar sorts of capabilities to SQL Server hosted on virtual machines in Azure. So there is a template that you can use to spin up virtual machine-based SQL Server instances in Azure, and Microsoft will do things like automatically patch it for you and automatically back it up for you, so you don't have to then go and manually configure those things out of the box. And it's good to see that. So I think there was Server 2016 all the way back at the start of the year was the first cut of that capability. And the first example of the mention of Kubernetes in Azure. So the Kubernetes offering on Azure Container Services was made generally available all the way back in February. And I'm sure over the last few months you've been unable to miss containers and Kubernetes in particular inside of Azure, and we'll see that as we go through the year that we see more and more of that. And then the last kind of main announcement for that period was the new cross-platform CLI. So Microsoft realized that the first version of the cross-platform CLI, which was Node.js, wasn't really suitable for a lot of admin scenarios. They had a lot of feedback that said it was hard to pipe content into and out of the very first cross-platform CLI, and that I don't know if you've ever tried to restore Node packages in environments, but it's like you're reinstalling the internet. It can take some time to pull down and lay down Node packages using npm. So the new CLI is written in Ruby. Well, that might be wrong. I think it's actually Python, but regardless, the change was made so that you don't have to have this massive footprint of Node modules laid down just so you can run a command line tool. And because they're basing it on a fairly well-known language that would be present on most Linux distributions, you're probably reducing the amount of effort you need to go to get this up and running off of a Windows platform. That's January and February. If we keep going at this rate, we'll be ready for pizzas before they're here. I need to slow down. Are there any questions about any of the stuff on there?
Yeah, I'll slow you down.
Okay.
Has ACS been replaced by AKS, or are they still available as two separate services?
It's a good question. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, but the reality is that the AKS, Microsoft hasn't really done themselves any favors with the naming scheme for that. So they said Azure Kubernetes Service ACS, and then the ACS offerings which don't involve managed Kubernetes are still there, but they're not as well covered in the documentation. So the documentation at the moment is a little bit unclear as to what your options are. So the bottom line is that you can still do ACS, Azure Container Service, where you can do top to bottom management of both your orchestrator like Kubernetes, Docker Swarm, or DCOS. Or you can go for AKS if you're all in on Kubernetes and benefit from that managed Kubernetes setup where you're not having to manage the actual orchestrator nodes, and they're patched and made available for you by Microsoft at no cost. So ACS is still there. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. Clearly Microsoft's betting big on Kubernetes, as is, it seems, most of the industry. And people like Docker are even looking clearly at that now and saying, well, we need to properly support Kubernetes at a deeper level. I don't think their orchestrators are going to go away anytime soon. I'm on a project at the moment that's standing up capability built on Docker Swarm through a vendor that I'm working with. So I don't think that just yet, but to answer your question, ACS is still there and you can choose your orchestrator of choice, but AKS, if you're on Kubernetes, would probably be the choice to make because it's managed for you. Because no one wants to have to manage infrastructure. That's why we like platform as a service offerings, right? Sorry if you're an infrastructure management guy. Any other questions? No? Okay, cool. March and April, Azure Stack Technical Preview 3. Azure Stack. Who's deployed Azure Stack? I know you probably have. Yeah, cool. So this is probably, Azure Stack is probably Microsoft's ace in the hole when it comes to doing hybrid cloud. It would be very interesting if AWS ever came up with an AWS stack or equivalent offering, because they've kind of been walking away from what their kind of core tenet is, that, you know, it's all about the cloud and it's all about AWS, and, you know, if you're not in the public cloud, you're not really in the cloud, whereas Microsoft is acknowledging that hybrid's going to be a world that they need to support going forward, and not just hybrid running on VMware or Hyper-V in your data center, but potentially also giving you a intermediate step where you can run Azure-like environments in your own data center, migrate your workloads into those private cloud spaces, and then potentially in the longer term migrate them into Azure. Azure Stack's pretty cool because anything you can do in Azure, you can do it on Azure Stack. So the Resource Manager API lives in Azure Stack. So if you build a template to run it in the Azure public cloud, if it's for a service that's available on Azure Stack, you can run exactly the same template in your own data center if you've stood Azure Stack up. So back in April, we got TP3, Technical Preview 3, and as we'll see, we've now got the ability to actually stand that up at this point in the year. So I put here, did I miss it? I've jumped ahead of myself here. So I put MongoDB API for Cosmos DB. So I've kind of missed the fact that Document DB kind of went away and became an API over the top of this thing called Cosmos DB. It's really just a larger representation of what Document DB originally was, as a NoSQL document database. Cosmos changed a bunch of things around the availability model and the consistency model, and the throughput and availability, but it was just taking the Document DB concept and kind of growing it to be much broader and more suitable to service other workload types. And what Microsoft has done quite cleverly is they took Document DB and they didn't throw the concept out completely. They made Document DB an API on top of Cosmos. So now when you create a new Cosmos DB instance, you can say what API you want to have available to you. So you say, I want a SQL interface over the top, which is what Document DB gives you. It gives you a SQL-like language that allows you to query a NoSQL database. MongoDB, you can now do Mongo apps where the data is stored in Cosmos DB, but as far as your Mongo client is concerned, it's talking to a MongoDB on the back end. Microsoft's done a lot of these this year that we'll see as we go through the year. Management is always a challenge in the cloud, and we probably have, in my opinion, probably too many ways to manage Azure at the moment. So hopefully next year we'll see up in terms of what we have available to us. But back in March, April, we had the general availability of Azure Advisor, which if you use the equivalent in AWS, will try and help guide you on what the best way to manage your workloads is using the resources that are available in Azure. Azure Health, so I used that just a couple of weeks ago when there was some service bus issues in Australia East. It was good. It told me exactly what was going on by configuring some alerts in Azure Health. And then Azure Monitor. So Microsoft's probably got ways to do monitoring and alerting inside of Azure at the moment, and Monitor was probably the first cut to try and create almost like a cloud trail type of experience inside of Azure, where I can just send all my ops logs to one place and then have a kind of a single place to go to get all that information. More news for virtual machines. So L-series managed disks and instance metadata were all made available. So instance metadata is really useful in that video that we were watching before about availability zones. The availability zone that a virtual machine lives in now is part of the instance metadata. So if you've worked with instance metadata on AWS, you'd know it's a local REST HTTP endpoint that you can call in scripts that you might run on local machines that will tell you things about the instance that you're running on. So quite useful information around patching, next update of the virtual machine, what extensions are deployed onto it, and other metadata about the machine, like what zone it's on, and those sorts of things. So that was kind of a big gap, I think, for a while. Being able to write self-aware scripts on hosts is really quite a useful thing to be able to do. Azure Backup, being able to go and browse Azure Backup and be able to do file level restore out of Azure Backup for both Windows and Linux virtual machines is pretty handy. I know I don't really want to have to restore an entire virtual machine just so I can recover a single file. To do that with Azure, this is changing Azure Backup. And as I said, Microsoft trying to address the demands people are placing on Azure SQL database by introducing additional performance tiers. And later in the year, we got to the point where we didn't have to up a tier to get access to more storage. So I'll have a look at that later. Azure Container Registry. So I think what's interesting for me going back through the year is it feels to me like the last 6 months have all been sort of about containers and container services in Azure. But the reality is actually Microsoft's been doing it probably for the last couple of years to one degree or another, because if Container Registry went GA all the way back in even April, preview for at least 3 to 6 months before that point. So it's been there since probably at least the middle of 2016. So, it's good to see that they're trying to look over the horizon to see what's next, and clearly managed to see this wave and catch it, which is good for us if we're working in this space. Cognitive Services API. So we had Jordan Knight from Microsoft earlier in the year come and talk to us about building bots using things like Lewis and the language understanding services and the other cognitive APIs in Azure. So the face, computer vision, and content moderation services all went generally available back in this period earlier in the year. And then geographic routing for Azure Traffic Manager. So if you want to do least latency routing based on geo-IP, that capability exists to you inside of Traffic Manager. It's one of those unsung services in Azure Traffic Manager. It doesn't get a lot of love. To use it themselves quite heavily. So I don't talk about it in this session, but Container Registry now has a geo available option where you can upload a container image into, say, a container registry that's hosted in Australia East. Choose multiple geographies that you want that image to be available in. Microsoft will create a container registry in that region. They'll transfer the image to a container registry in that region, but as far as consumers are concerned, they're talking to one endpoint, and that one endpoint is being serviced by a traffic manager because it's all REST-based. The benefit there is that if you've got developers or workloads that are hosted elsewhere in the world, as far as they're concerned, you can just give them one ACR repository URL, and they'll be able to pull images from that, and it won't matter the fact that it's somewhere outside of the repository that you're pushing to. And that's delivered through the magic of Traffic Manager. There's actually an Azure Friday video with the guys from the ACR team talking about that, and they reference Traffic Manager in that video. So worth having a look at if you do a lot of REST or HTTP-based workloads, because Traffic Manager is kind of one of those turnkey solutions if you want to do multi-region availability in Azure. Yes. Yep.
With the geo routing, could you use that to block out users from other countries?
Could you use geo availability to block? I haven't seen if the geo routing works to that level, but that sounds to me like it would be something you would need to probably bake into your application layer, or potentially put a WAF between the Traffic Manager endpoint and your actual application to manage that. It's a good question. I don't know. I would have to have a look to see if that's an available feature. It sounds like it would make sense, but I guess the challenge with geo-IP is not always accurate. As people found with Microsoft Azure, I think last year or the year before, they ran out of IP addresses in one of the US data centers, and they started issuing IP addresses that were geo-IP to somewhere like Mexico. So people were starting to get blocked because those IPs weren't properly geo-recognized. But good question. I don't know is the simple answer. We could have a look afterwards, though. If you want to grab me, we'll have a look, see if that's something that you can do. All right, May and June, already halfway through the year. This is perfect. More VMs. And VMs this year have about being able to do AI and ML type workloads. Take something like Tensor and TensorFlow out of the Google stable and run it quite happily inside of Azure on their high-end VMs that are designed with GPU chips to do that stuff. It's pretty cool. There was a preview announced of the ND series earlier in the year, so not all these series have made it yet to Australia, I might add. What we'll see next year is we'll start to see a broadening of those offerings, but if you've got workloads that aren't geo-restricted, then you certainly have access to these VM styles in other regions. The series is using NVIDIA P40 and P100 chips to really provide you with high-end GPU access to your ML models or AI logic routines. I'm not an AI or an ML person, so maybe that gets you excited, but it's like it's a chip. It does processing, it's awesome. There was a DV2 price drop, which has been good because it's driven a lot of demand, but it's bad because it's also meant that there's been a crunch on the D series VMs in most regions because the prices of those VMs dropped quite substantially and people just all piled in and went, I'll take D series VMs, please. But again, Microsoft really driving down the price, particularly when they're going to release a new edition of a series. So the DV2 price drop was related to the release of the DV3 series, which was with some updated CPUs, but effectively had the same sort of performance metric. And when Microsoft released the DV3, they actually price matched the DV2 prices that they'd announced with this price drop. Yeah, so I obviously preempted myself. In March, April, I put MongoDB API for Cosmos DB, and then magically it was renamed after the fact that I already referenced it. So May, June, DocumentDB is now Cosmos DB. That happened at a main event where there was a lot of focus on Cosmos DB as a geo-available NoSQL DB. Azure Cloud Shell in preview. If you go to shell.microsoft.com, full screen shell in your web browser, which is pretty cool. We'll take a look at that. Actually, why don't we do that? Let's take a look at that. At this point, the people who are on the Hangout and on the live stream won't get to see that, but that's too bad. Let's see if I can break things by stopping sharing my screen, duplicating my screen. And we go to https shell.azure.com. This will take a little while to start up. And what I'm sharing at the moment. Nothing. No. So I'll choose cloud. This may bomb out because this subscription's about to be retired. So this is a full screen browser session. You can embed it anywhere you want. So it's going to connect to a terminal. This is Bash shell. You can do it. This is all running on Kubernetes under the covers as well. You can do Emacs, which no one understands how to escape from. And then at this point, I'll go, what do I want? I want Control X, and then I want to do, what's the name of the game with the dropping blocks?
Tetris.
Tetris. Okay. Where are we? Oh, you know what? Control X, Control C. Excellent. I've got the other vector next. The bottom line is that this full cloud shell bash, you have Terraform in here if you want to use Terraform. Okay. Simon. See what I have actually here. It's probably a bit of a mess if I've been using it. Yep. Frequently, but you can pull down files, you can run commands locally. So that's the .NET core runtime. The great news is with the Cloud Shell now, because you've got full screen, you no longer even need to log into the portal to get access to this. You can go to shell.azure.com and it will start up. If you're a PowerShell guy, you can come in and just choose PowerShell, which is also GA as of the last month. All right, so let's go back to the presentation. That'll run in the background. Cool. Azure Mobile Management app, if you haven't had a look at that, it's worth having a look. on your mobile phone, so it's available for iOS and Android. You can install it and configure your subscriptions and log in and manage on the go if you really want to. Personally, I prefer not to do that, but it's available if you want to do it, and you need to do quick okay. I blew my stream up. Okay, let's try again. I'm just gonna. Okay. Okay. Yep. Because I stopped screen sharing. Let's just extend my screen. Yeah, you can see me. Good. Goodo. So it should be back on again, hopefully. Still me. It's a little bit of a lag. So where were we? Yep, mobile management app, definitely worth having a look at if you're using that on Azure. Azure database for MySQL and PostgreSQL. So if you're a RDS user in AWS or you're a heavy-duty Linux database person, then you now have managed database for both Postgres and MySQL available to you if you want to go and do those. Those are still currently in preview, but they're quite innovative if you want to get away from managing the underlying OS and MySQL and PostgreSQL setup available to you. Video indexer preview, this is pretty interesting. So you upload some videos and it gets run through an ML routine. Microsoft will give you some insights about the video, things like number of people and words that were spoken during the video and all sorts of things without you having to do a lot of work to make that happen. Recently, they've made that more powerful by allowing you to upload like word lists and what have you so that it can be more specific to, say, an industry that you're in. I haven't played too heavily with this, but I think it's where we're starting to see a lot of interesting innovation in the cloud space is being able to combine multiple services on the back end to enrich a service like Azure Media Services to provide you a lot more useful information than just being able to upload video and transcode it. You can now start to do things like real-time conversion, real-time live captioning, but in other languages as well. So if you watch any of the Microsoft events in the last few months, you'll see the live captioning that's going on. Part of that, it's not perfect, but it does a pretty good job, and that's being done in real time by the media services offering that Microsoft's running inside of Azure. So if you do a lot of media streaming, definitely worth having a look at that. Azure Functions Runtime Preview. So I've been using Functions, I guess, now for almost 2 years. The interesting thing here is that what they're doing with this piece of work is they're enabling you to run it anywhere. Time will run on-prem on your own servers if you want. It'll be containerized in a Docker container, so notionally you could even run it on, say, an AWS or a Google Compute Engine if you wanted to, and leverage the power of the Functions runtime in other environments. And that's really novel. So we've got some of that with Lambda, being able to run Lambda on Edge, but you're not going to see Lambda, I suspect, running in the data center, because AWS doesn't want you to stay in your data center. They want you in their cloud. I mean, Microsoft would like you to come in their cloud as well, but they're doing that through other means by enabling people to build solutions that are easier to migrate into their cloud at some future point in time. Microsoft joined the Cloud Foundry Foundation. So if you haven't had a look at Cloud Foundry, which is like a PaaS platform that you can run in your own data center, it's worth having a look at. So it and OpenShift are probably the two big players in that space, to both enabling these services to run in the Azure cloud, but then also contributing back to them. So we're seeing a lot of that with things like the work they're doing with the Kubernetes community to enable things like the virtual kubelet. Obviously, Brendan Burns, who's one of the key people in the Azure space, is one of the leaders of the Kubernetes community. So we're seeing Microsoft really start to get heavily embedded back into these things, and joining things like the Cloud Foundry Foundation is part of that, because they stay at a table, but they also have the ability to contribute things back into the organization that they've helped enable for their cloud. And then Microsoft acquired a business called Deus earlier in the year. And the first thing that Deus shipped after being acquired by Microsoft was Draft, which is a developer tool to help speed up the development and delivery of Kubernetes-based solutions. I haven't played heavily with this, but it seems to have gotten a lot of positive responses from people who work in that space. It's good to see, Microsoft again allowing people to get on with what they do after acquiring them. And then if you're an infrastructure guy, VPN gateways. So being able to stand up brand new VPN gateway tiers, giving you a 6 times performance boost over what you could get before. I think with this changes, you can get now up to, I think, 1.25 gig a second throughput on a VPN gateway at the push of a button as well. That's what I like about all this stuff, is there's no special magic or kit required. You can literally go in and say, give me one of those and here's my wallet. But you get what you pay for. Any questions on anything on that?
On the on-premise function, what are the bindings of the cloud?
Good question. I haven't looked at it. Yeah. So the runtime's obviously only part of the benefit of using functions. Also the bindings and the event-based model. I mean, I haven't played with this yet. Yeah, it's been talked about a lot, but whether or not, I guess the challenge with bindings is they're going to have to figure out how they do bindings and what they're worth binding to. You can write your own binder. I think there is a specs published, so I would expect what will happen is people will maybe write generic binders for things like SQL Server, for Oracle, maybe End Service Bus, those sorts of things, and allow them to be used on-prem. That's where I would expect it to go, or even something really basic like a AQMP, event-based mechanism where you can subscribe to anything like RabbitMQ. You can change the service bus if you want, those sorts of things. But yeah, you're right. I don't know what the details are around those bindings for on-prem yet. Anything else? Nope. Okay. July, August. Feels like we're almost at the end of the year already. Azure Container Instances preview. I think this with AKS, so the Managed Kubernetes Service, plus what's now known as the Virtual Kubelet, will be kind of where you'll land if you want to do almost entirely PaaS-based Kubernetes hosted Docker containers. There's a lot of buzzwords in that sentence, but it is what it is. And it will take you, it'll still not quite be as good as PaaS where you're on, say, web apps for containers on app service, but it'll be pretty close, and you'll get the familiarity of Kubernetes management API that you might be using elsewhere in your organization. But you won't have to do a lot of maintenance around spinning up and managing virtual machines or having to then manage orchestrators as well. The great thing about container instances is that anywhere there's an Azure data center, you can say, give me an instance in that data center, and you don't have to do anything else like configure virtual networks, configure app services, allocate IP addresses. Once the connector back into Kubernetes is enabled, literally you'll be able to stand up a Kubernetes management service, say in Australia East, and then manage all of your container instances regardless of where they're hosted globally, which is pretty phenomenal power when you think about it. Not quite there yet, but instances give you that capability. I think they're a bit undersold at the moment if you go and look at some of the examples that they're being used for, but I think that's because the management side of it's missing still at the moment. We're doing a lot of cloud-based integration with things like storage queues or service bus or Cosmos DB where there's not actually a virtual network to connect to. Then a container instance running a Docker container is probably a really good place to have a look at building a solution for. If you've got a Docker container image that needs to connect to a virtual network, container instances is not really the thing for you at this point. Maybe in the future cycle, we'll see some of that more infrastructure as a service offering come out to play. Alongside of that, Microsoft announced Event Grid. So we've actually got a gentleman who's going to come and speak next year about that. So stay tuned for that. And that's an interesting topic because that offers anything in Azure as an event source published onto a service that you can subscribe to. So if you think about what you can do with Azure Functions and the bindings, with the limited number of services they have bindings for, if you imagine all the services in Azure publishing events of various flavors onto Event Grid, and then you can do anything you want off of those events. It's probably fairly abstract, particularly if you do a lot of infrastructure work, but I think infrastructure is where some of that will become key, because all of a sudden an event happening somewhere else in Azure, you might be able to have an Azure automation script that's attached to that, listening for that event. And when that event happens, you can trigger an Azure automation script and run it without having to do any wiring up on the other end. All you say is, I just want to listen to this event type. It's been a bit quiet on that front the last few months. The key scenario that they talk about is blob file uploaded into Azure storage. Interesting happen. Probably because there's probably a lot of plumbing work to be done under the covers to serviceable at the scale it'll need to be, given the volume of services that are in Azure and the volume of tenants that are in Azure, et cetera, et cetera. It just becomes very quick, very big, very quickly. You could start to pre-order Azure Stack. So people were already out there apparently buying it. That's what we were being told by Microsoft, and a couple of guys put their hands up in the room. So obviously it's something that's got traction, which is good to see. And then as part of the work that Microsoft did with the field programmable gate arrays, FPGAs, they enabled a faster faster networking connectivity capability inside of VMs. So we can now get VMs of particular flavors from Linux, and some of the newer Windows VMs can support local VNet connections up to 25 gigs per second, which is pretty good if you're doing HPC scenarios and you need fast interconnects between hosts, and that capability exists for you. Yeah, do you want to answer it for me? Just, sorry. So for those people on the live stream, we've got pizza coming, which probably doesn't mean anything to you if you're watching this in 6 months and wondering what's going on. Someone might want to go and help Stefan, because there's a fair number of pizzas. All right, well, maybe we'll just take a quick pause. Let's just take a quick pause. So I can pause the live stream, I think. No, I can't. Can I? Okay, so that's not gonna pause. It's all right. I can edit it out later. That's all right. So any questions about what's up there at the moment from July and August? No, just want pizza or Xboxes.
I mean the SQL, what was the SQL TDE?
This one here? So SQL TDE is transparent data encryption. So it's about encrypting records at rest. In order to do that, you need to provide a key, like a PKI key. On-prem, you generate that key and then you load it into SQL Server, and then you have to do the lifecycle management of that key. With Azure SQL Database, you had TDE available for a while, but it was with a Microsoft generated key, which didn't make people necessarily happy if they were wanting to have the ability to extract that data and take it somewhere else, or they had key management infrastructure in place already to do that internally.
Does it integrate with the Key Vault?
Does the BYOK preview integrate with Key Vault? I haven't looked. Most of the key management stuff inside of Azure does tend to rely on Key Vault as the source for certificates, because it makes sense that if you've got a secrets and key management capability, that you would leverage it. But for the purpose of this, the bottom line is that at least you can bring your own key. So if you've got a HSM or a key management facility in-house already, you can now bring your key and deploy it onto Microsoft's infrastructure, which means notionally anybody that isn't part of your organization doesn't have access to that data anymore. Whereas with the key infrastructure with TDE, if someone can get access to the Microsoft environment, they can notionally decrypt the data with that key.
So the encryption is at the database level, or that go down to the table, or the
so TDE works at the it's transparent, so it's actually at the record level. Records are written into storage; they're already encrypted. So it's called transparent data encryption because from the end user's perspective, it's not managed by the SQL Server infrastructure. Okay. Yeah, the under the covers SQL Server storage and Azure storage story around encryption. You can go and read about it. They've published how they do it. Even things like in Office 365 SharePoint Online, way of doing storage so that data is spread across multiple nodes on the back end, is encrypted and can't be easily, if someone went into a Microsoft data center and stole 15 racks, they'd maybe have absolutely no way of, they would have no way of knowing when online data is stored because it's written in lots of different locations multiple times and is encrypted. So it's we see a very simple interface as managers of infrastructure or developers, but behind the scenes it actually gets quite, which is cool, but sometimes your head explodes when they kind of pull the covers back a little bit and you see underneath it. What are the other key things on here? So Azure Service Health, so what this does is it allows you to see your specific services. So rather than just getting a generic, there's a fault in Australia East, you can now drill into it and see what specifically in your services landscape is being affected. We'll get to the pizza in a minute. It'll stay warm, I'm sure. Yeah, it's okay. It smells pretty good, I know that much. App services, so App Service Environment version 2 shipped in August. So App Service V1. If you're in FSI and government, you love App Service Environments because it gives you separate PAS with a big tick next to a box that makes security people happy because you can say I'm isolated from everybody else. But it also means that you need to hand over your firstborn because they cost so much to run. Same flexibility as the co-tenanted app service instances, but Microsoft with V2 addressed some of the challenges around time to create, modernize some of the CPU variants that were available via it, and just allowed you to have a better management experience. But they didn't address the pricing challenge, but then you are effectively reserving racks of compute in Microsoft's data center, so you're effectively paying a reserved price for that infrastructure. And they broadened out their support for deployments. If you do Java development, Maven is one of the key tools you use to do build and deployment and package management. Azure batch rendering. So Microsoft doesn't talk very much about kind of the media side of the platform very much, but they have an announcement later in the year where they've got a partnership with Autodesk. So if you do large batch rendering type jobs out the back of things like 3D Studio Max, you can now use Azure as a target and push your rendering jobs up into Azure. Rendering service will take care of that for you. Powerful service. I think in Australia our biggest challenge is having a fat enough pipe to push those jobs up into Azure and then pull the resulting jobs back down again. But it's there if you need it. July and August, we kind of talked about the SQL TDE stuff already. Want to ask about? No?
ACI is still in preview?
ACI is actually still in preview, yeah. Yep. I was having a look at some of this stuff last night just to confirm because it's been announced and then there's not been a follow-on announcement from that.
It's interesting they announced it in September.
Yeah.
AWS announced its own version just recently.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's also to do with of where the teams are at internally on doing some of this stuff. And if you look at how much stuff has been launched in Azure this year, there's no way that there's enough people to concentrate deeply on every single thing. And when Microsoft does the public previews, they set pretty tight metrics in terms of criteria that has to be met before a service will go to general availability. So it could be things like, amount of service consumption, how few faults there are, how many incidents there are. There are quite active communities that people like Stefan and myself are a part of where they'll be getting a lot of feedback around what's suitable and what's not suitable. So given everything that's gone on with AKS, I suspect that's probably where most of the container focus has been. And that whole connector story, so when they announced ACI, they announced the Kubernetes connector, which has since morphed into the virtual kubelet. That needs to settle down and it probably needs to have broader community support outside of Azure first before they probably push this. And there's so much in the way of container services capability inside of Azure that ACI not being GA is not a blocker if you want to use containers. And things like even here we talk about web apps for containers going GA. That's probably about as close to ACI as you can get today in a PaaS world. With extra capabilities that you don't get with ACI, like doing domain name mapping, port restriction so that you're only servicing HTTP workloads into your container. But that's where I suspect most of the focus has been. But good point. Good point for sure. App service on Linux. So this is a cool one. I'm using this quite heavily with web apps for containers at the moment. All the goodness that you get for app service on Windows, you get that now for Linux as well. So you can do things like DNS management, SSL certificates, multiple instances of apps running on the same app service with slots, all those sorts of things. So that you don't have 100% compatibility between the two platforms just yet, because there's things like managed service identity, which is very specific to the Windows infrastructure. That's hard for Microsoft to deliver on Linux, but they are working towards having compatibility between the two. But if you're interested in using ACI for production workloads, web apps for containers is probably, and it's a web workload, then web apps for containers is probably the next best thing. So my web apps for containers will become ACI instances managed by Kubernetes when all that stuff is GA at some point in the future. Azure Functions. So in September, Microsoft announced cross-platform support for this. So if you're a non-Windows-based developer, you can now develop functions. So if you're on Mac, you can use .NET Core to write your own functions. You've always been able to do Node-based functions previously, but now you've kind of got a full developer story as well on the platform. So if you use Visual Studio for Mac, which was the Xamarin Studio previously, you now have all the tooling you need inside of that to be able to develop functions, without having to run a Windows box anywhere to get up and running for that. So that's really cool. And the App Insights stuff, if you're doing functions and you want metrics, turning on App Insights is as easy as adding a App Insights telemetry key to your configured app service instance, and you start emitting all of the logging information behind the scenes and execution timelines for app service, excuse me, for the functions, without having to do a lot of code work, which is really awesome. Azure Stack shipped, finally. So it's like a mini story through these slides, right? We had the TP3, and then we had it's ready for order, and now it's actually shipping. So I'm sure Jeffrey Snover was really happy. Yeah, I know, it's exciting days, isn't it? Makes me get out of bed in the morning thinking about Azure Stack. I don't know why people are laughing. I'm serious when I say that. Azure Security Center, so expanding the value of this by giving some coverage on-prem. And also giving you the ability to do multi-cloud support by installing agents onto virtual machines in other clouds as well. So Security Center, the free tier, is awesome if you're not using it already and you've got VM-based workloads in Azure. You should go and have a look at them and tell you what's going on and scare the pants off you. If you want to do things like heuristic management through traffic analysis on your networks and behaviors on your virtual machines, then you can go up to the paid tier for a Security Center, and it will start to emit insights in the event that people are doing nefarious things that you can't spot through your usual mechanisms. Cost management. So Microsoft acquired a company called Cloudin and immediately turned their product into a free offering on the Azure platform. So you can now go and do cost management free of charge in Azure, which is always a big challenge, particularly at the enterprise level, where you might have with lots of people with access to lots of subscriptions. I have access to a bunch of different enterprise subscriptions, and it's been interesting. I can now actually start to see the cost associated with those individual subscriptions, whereas before all that stuff was locked out from me. Even though I was an owner of the subscription, I didn't have the permissions to hit the billing API. There was, I think, this last week, there's been some additional work done around starting to expose some of that stuff through APIs and being able to do cost management, which is a key part of cloud environments generally, and certainly in Azure is something that people want to stop developers being able to bankrupt their business by turning on a series of G5 machines and leaving them running, or someone breaking into your environment and running Bitcoin mining farms and doing the same. So it's an important part of any cloud environment. Center launches, if you haven't had a look at that and you're doing migration, worth going and having a look. There's a bunch of literature and some tools that will help you identify workload styles and types to do migrations into Azure more easily. Shell and Cloud Shell Preview, which, as we saw, is now GA as well. So we now have that, both Bash and PowerShell available to us. Great thing there is you don't need to install anything locally. You've got commandlets available to you. You're already logged into your Azure subscription as yourself, so whatever you have permissions to do, you can do it all inside of a browser. Just don't let your kids use your browser when you're logged into the portal. Either that or use resource group blocks to make sure you can't accidentally delete stuff. And then again, like the security center stuff, SQL vulnerability assessment. So you can now run this across Azure SQL database, and it'll tell you if you've got any weak spots in the way your databases are built and made available to apps, and also being made available to SQL Server on-prem as well. So Microsoft's going above and beyond. They're not just focusing on building these out for cloud, they're also focusing on building this for, I would have to say, the most recent generation of their offerings on-prem as well. So you're seeing a lot of the services flow back out of the cloud into things like Windows Server, SharePoint, Exchange, and in this case, SQL Server. You've got those capabilities now being surfaced out of their learnings at running at cloud scale. Almost done. Oh, September, October. We're not almost done. And you know why there's lots of stuff in September, October? Because there was Ignite, and it kind of went a bit doolally at Ignite. So our friend Managed Kubernetes for ACS was announced here and promptly confused the hell out of everybody of whether it was called ACS, AKS, or anything else. But the bottom line is you still have the ability to do completely self-managed orchestrators on ACS, or you can choose the Managed Kubernetes offering on ACS if you want. Managed tiers, and I think this shows you the speed at which things change. So we had the GA of Container Registry earlier in the year. If you log into the portal now, that originally GA'd version of Container Registry is called Classic. Classic. And it's not even a year old. So the big change with these new managed tiers for Container Registry is you can now register webhooks on registries or on repositories, so that when images are published to the repositories, you can do other things like continuous deployment into web apps for containers, or trigger things in Kubernetes to kick off and run. You need to run at the premium tier in Container Registry to get access to all the geo availability stuff as well if you want. And also, and it seems to me to be an oversight in the original offering, is you can actually delete images out of these new managed tiers, whereas the original Container Registry, it was like just a write once image repository. And I think once you just ran out of that 500 terabyte storage account behind the scenes, you just had to delete the repository and start again. But with these managed tiers, you now have the ability to kind of manage images that are published into those repositories. DDoS protection preview. So you are protected from DDoS by the platform already. What this gives you is it gives you a much better ability to control your specific experience for DDoS protection, because clearly the DDoS protection that Microsoft needs for its global services is much different to your little corner computer store's DDoS protection. So with this, you now have the ability to say, well, when I hit these thresholds, treat that like a DDoS and don't service from a technical perspective, and probably having a denial of service more from a financial perspective. So DDoS protection is about protecting you from financial DDoS at the end of the day, because in a very short space of time with the wrong configuration in your environment, spend a lot of money, and that's probably something that you don't want to do. So DDoS protection is there if you want to use that. Azure File Sync and Snapshots Preview. So I think I said at the time, the thing I'm really happy about is that Microsoft didn't call this OneDrive for Azure and confuse us additionally further, because we already have OneDrive for consumer and OneDrive for business. So this is a similar sort of concept, but you can deploy the sync agent onto, say, servers in your data center and do file syncs up into Azure storage accounts. It's not designed as a backup facility, Azure file shares, but you could do it as a way to maybe provide static media that's going to be published via a website that's referencing storage accounts. Oh, what have I done? That's all right. Let's see. Google Hangouts is playing up on me.
Oh, it's back.
It's back. Okay. All right, good. Yes, and virtual networking connectivity for SQL Server, for Azure SQL database and storage accounts. So that's kind of been a big ask for a while. People don't like the fact that both these things provide public HTTP-based endpoints, albeit they are secure by default. With these, you can now basically firewall off the public endpoints and then just connect them into a virtual network, similar to what you can do with S3 buckets and other offerings inside of AWS with VPCs. So we'll see how many other services pick this up, but these are kind of the two core services that most people ask to see privately available and not published onto the internet. So it's good to see them making changes on that. FV2 VMs ship. are made available. So they're Xeon based. They're the fastest CPUs on Azure. They're not the fastest GPUs, but the fastest CPUs. So if you want to do CPU-based workload styles, you can use these guys rather than the L series, which are GPU-based. Azure Data Box, so Microsoft competing there with the likes of Snowball. So you now have the ability to buy some hardware, put it in your data center and stream off terabytes of data to it, and then ship the device to Microsoft rather than just shipping them lots of disks. I haven't seen one of those yet in real life, but the pictures look pretty, and Microsoft was using it before they announced the service, so they have a case study that talks about how they're doing that. Data, you want to move it to the cloud, that's the way you want to do it, rather than buying lots of disks that you attach to servers in your data center. Azure Alerts, I used this recently with Azure Health to tell me about service status of an ongoing event inside of Australia East. Well, the additional benefit Microsoft announced here is that you can now use webhooks to integrate it into, say, ServiceNow. If you're doing that as your service management solution, you're not tied to having to go and look in the Azure portal and creating these siloed worlds to find out what's going on in your entire environment. With this ability, you can now use things like ServiceNow as the source, as the event target out of Azure. And then the last one is a bit of a one of those, believe it when I see it, and we'll see how many people demand it, is Microsoft announced a partnership with Cray to make Cray supercomputers available inside of Azure. They were pretty clear that they won't stand up Crays in every single region, and then you'll be able to buy timeshare on a Cray supercomputer. It'll be almost like a bare metal offering that you can go and sign up for if you have specific workloads that would benefit from running on a Cray supercomputer. To be honest, I'm surprised Cray's even still a company, but there we are. I don't work in that space, so clearly I'm not the target yet. Any question across September and October? Because yes.
Databox, I can't get an ETA for Australia out of my account team.
I don't know, but I could ask as well and see what I get back. Yeah. So it was only announced at Ignite or just after Ignite. So given that it took a while for import-export service to light up in Australia as well. So I wouldn't hold my breath because they've actually got to physically manufacture those boxes as well. So I would imagine that we'll see it here next year. There are a lot of services in Australia that are not available yet. If you see if I can shake a tree for you and get you a rough ETA. If it's not publicly published, then it could be hard to confirm, but at least I can shake other trees and see what falls out. But yeah, no, good question. November and December, and then we're almost done. And then I have some T-shirts to give away, and then we can have pizza. Or we can have pizza and I can give T-shirts away. Or I can just give Xboxes away and then everyone can go and I can eat all the pizza. I don't know. All right, okay. Azure SQL database, there we are. So this is what I mean by the AI machine learning stuff really starting to benefit you now, is by default, Microsoft reckons that their automatic database tuning routines that are machine learning based are better than your DBAs. So they will be turning it on by default for all new instances that you create, which means that any poorly performing SQL queries will be automatically tuned for you. You have to physically go and turn it off. And it sounds scary, but when you think that Microsoft writes the database engine and has been doing, passive plan analysis using these routines probably for as long as the service has lived in Azure, they probably have a pretty good idea of the sorts of scenarios that they can tune better for you when you deploy a database in this environment. So it'd be interesting to see where that goes, but we'll start to see more of those sorts of things come into the environment where they will start to proactively manage things on your behalf. That won't be a on-off thing, it'll be an on and then it will be constantly being tuned. So this isn't just a one-on, turn it on, and then it's immediately fixed. It will continually monitor what's going on and make changes over time, and you'll be able to go back and roll back through the plan change history for changes that the machine learning based tuning algorithm has made on your databases. Probably scares some people to think about that, but I also think it's great, from an end user perspective that, if I'm seeing poor performance, the machine might notice it before a human does and make that change before a human even realizes that it's an issue, which would be awesome. I'd prefer to spend my time doing other things other than tuning database queries, to be honest. I don't know about you guys. Any DBAs in the room? Sort of, okay, all right. So maybe with the exception of yourself, sir, the rest of us probably enjoy things other than SQL tuning. You can turn it off, but so it's there already, but you have to turn it on. For new, what they're saying as of these 2 months, when you create a new Azure SQL database instance, this will be on by default. So you'll actually have to explicit choice to turn it off. If I was someone doing this and I was concerned about that, I would deploy this and enable this in my dev test environments and see what the changes are, and then turn it on in production. However, your production performance will be very different to your test and development. The demands placed on those environments are going to be completely different. So a machine learning algorithm going against your dev environment is going to generate very different results to a machine learning algorithm going against your production environment, because the performance characteristics of those two environments is quite variant. So it's, I think that's going to be a big space. Cloud Shell, Bash, GA, yes, and so is PowerShell. So you can now go and manage all the things and not be worried that you're going to break anything because it's running generally available. As I said earlier, the Cosmos DB landscape, Microsoft's working hard to provide other APIs into the environment. So you now have an API that's consistent with Azure table storage. So if you're doing the key value stores in table storage, you can now use Cosmos as the backing store for that. Gremlin, which is out of the Apache landscape. So if you're doing data analytics, Gremlin is something you'd be used to. There's now a Gremlin API for storing your data in Azure Cosmos DB and reading it back out with Gremlin clients. And they announced a Cassandra API as being in preview. So I think this is where we're going to go. Cosmos DB as a highly available storage, and then a series of APIs over the top. And I don't think we're finished on that journey yet. I think there'll be more to come in future. I had someone ask me when I did some training around open source on Azure, what about MariaDB? So MariaDB is a fork of MySQL because Oracle bought MySQL, and a lot of people who are on MySQL, including I think some of the people who created MySQL, went, we don't want to be part of that, and they forked off and went B. So there's quite an overlap in terms of the capabilities there, but clearly MariaDB is not MySQL, which some people take as a benefit. I had someone say, so when will MariaDB be available on Azure Database, which is the managed database service offering that does MySQL and Postgres? And I just kind of shrugged and I went, well, they've got MySQL, why would they do MariaDB? And then 2 weeks later, they announced MariaDB. So again, I don't think this will be the last of those service offerings that we see come into that landscape. So Microsoft's taken all the Azure SQL database learnings from an infrastructure management standpoint. So Azure SQL database runs on top of Service Fabric, and they've taken the database engine learnings from Azure SQL database and they've applied it to MySQL and Postgres and Maria, because the infrastructure that's running these database engines is exactly the same as Azure SQL database. It's not Azure SQL DB masquerading as MySQL or Postgres, but the underlying Service Fabric infrastructure they're using to manage the storage and the compute that's used and availability that's used by the database engines is exactly the same. So it's good to see that. And the people that are building these services are not SQL DB engineers that are just dabbling in MySQL and Postgres. They're generally people that have worked fairly heavily on those tech stacks as well. So, you know, we're seeing that in containers. We're starting to see that in other tiers inside of Azure as well. Azure's Express Route, if you've ever stood up one of these things, it was always a bit of a black box in the past to figure out what was going on once it exited your gateway and left your network. Microsoft listened to that, and you've now got the ability to go and get additional metrics and graphical representations of traffic traversing your Express Route circuits. I haven't played with this, but it's definitely worth having a look at if you're doing a lot of Express Route stuff. I don't think there's a cost associated with it. It's literally just a capability they've lit up. If you've got Express Route circuits configured, you can go and have a look at the metrics of data traversing those circuits, which is pretty cool. Because I know it was a common question, is like, well, what happens once it goes out of my reach? And there was some very raw basic metrics you could get access to, but nothing to this level. The big one, which we were discussing earlier, the VMware migration hosting on Azure was announced to great fanfare from VMware by the sounds of it. Just in the last 24 hours, Microsoft's come out and clarified the position on that. It sounds like they're working with VMware to actually enable this scenario. Clearly there was some either some miscommunication or just a general lack of communication between both parties when this service was thought up and announced originally. Through the VMware community, it seems to be headed in the right direction. It'll be fairly similar, I think, from a deployment standpoint as the VMware on AWS is that it'll run on bare metal kit location next to the Azure workloads, but it won't actually be on Azure or in Azure. But, you know, at least Microsoft's trying to take that down the right path. A lot of the work that's been done around migrations this year has been around enabling VMware-based migrations from on-prem, either through agents at the ESX level or at the VM level. So watch this space. We'll see where that goes next year. I don't think that'll come to Australia very quickly, just because the kit they'll need to stand up for that capability take a while to stand up. Although having said that, the SAP stuff is here and it's running on bare metal in Australia already. So it'll probably be based on demand. New VMs in preview, B&M series are now GA. I won't go into the details of what they are. Needless to say, they're just letters of the alphabet. But if you are interested in certain workload styles, I do have a question about that if you want a t-shirt in a minute. And then I guess the big one was the LV2 preview, which is using the new AMD EPYC chipset, which again, if you've got specific workload types that are going to try and benefit from processor architectures, we're now getting to the point where we now have kind of the freedom to choose, you know, almost like we did on-prem, the amount of CPU we want, the amount of disk we want, the amount of memory we want, the throughput we want on the storage, on the network, and those sorts of things. So we'll continue to see that expand, I think. Virtual Kubelet and Open Service Broker API were announced at KubeCon. So Virtual Kubelet is the next iteration of the Kubernetes connector for ACI. It's open source. Open Service Broker API is going to be key for you to stand up services on Kubernetes in Azure that can discover other services in Azure. That is going to be important for you to build multi-tier apps that call outside of your Kubernetes cluster. I haven't played with that yet, but I think, you know, it's good to see that we're getting open source standards compliant stuff out of the Microsoft team when standing up this capability, rather than just building a Microsoft flavor of things as they may have done 10 years ago. Azure Bot Service and Lewis went GA just this last week, and they're now the Azure Bot Service has now got a new home inside of the portal, so you don't have to go to lots of different locations to get access to that. You can actually start to build that directly in the portal. And then Azure Archive Storage was also GA. So I haven't talked about all the new storage tiers that Microsoft announced this year. So we've now got cool storage and archive storage, and we've got storage tiers inside of the standard storage. I think there's hot storage. Cold, yeah, it's again, it's trying to compete with some of the AWS offerings. The difference is that you don't have to go down to the Glacier level like you do with AWS, and the recovery times on most of that data generally tends to be in the minutes and hours rather than the hours and days as it can get to with Glacier sometimes. All right, I'm at the end of the year. Any questions about anything I've talked about before we get on to giving away some stuff and eating some hopefully still lukewarm pizzas?
Have you heard when archive storage is going to be GA in Australia?
No idea, sorry. Come and, you've got a lot of questions. Come and grab me afterwards and I can ask questions. I think it's important to acknowledge that don't have much idea, because the engineering teams don't often communicate when things are going to happen, or given the rate of change that goes on inside of Azure. Sometimes, I know as an MVP, quite often I will know stuff before other people know it. And that's just because, the Microsoft guys are doing a lot of stuff. They're not just concentrating on Azure. And I know certainly the MVP community, sometimes it feels like Azure is the only space anyone cares about anymore, which is not the case. There's still a lot of other stuff those guys do. Probably because they have a rough window, but, there is still a limit to how open Microsoft can be with forward-looking statements, because they're a publicly listed company, albeit and archive storage in Australia is probably not going to have a material impact on Microsoft's business, but they still have things they have to follow from a compliance standpoint about what they can tell you. That's my take on it. Hopefully that was recorded So I can get some brownie points for that. But if you've got questions, come and ask me afterwards, and I can teams. It'll be a bit quiet because a lot of them are on vacation at the moment. But if you've got questions, I can ask the engineering teams and see if they'll at least give a rough window. All right. So let's give away some T-shirts. So these T-shirts you won't find them in Australia. I don't think they brought them to Australia. So these are Tux Ninja Cat T-shirts with some Java, some Linux commands on the back. So I have one XL, 2 larges, and a medium to give away. So I have 3 questions. So I'll have one T-shirt left over at the end. So how many announcements do you reckon were made in Azure this year? So I gave a hint earlier about a number. It's more than 50.
200.
So that's roughly about right.
190.
Colder.
220.
Warmer.
240. 225.
Too warm.
225.
Sorry, what was that?
225.
225. So what size do you want? Large? Extra large? All right, okay. There we are.
I've already got an interview.
You can do what you like with it. If you want to give it to someone else, by all means. All right, so that was the first one. So how many regions does Azure have? And we'll include those that are open and those that have been announced. Sorry?
44.
35.
40. 45, 50.
41.
So you want a large or a medium? A large. All right. Yeah, no, it's pretty cool how they keep expanding. The big ones for me will be these 2 here. It'll be interesting to see what these African ones do, because at the moment the African continent's not serviced at all, and I think there's a lot of untapped opportunity there. And AWS is also building out capability there next year as well, which is ironic given that's where AWS was originally developed. Yeah, so Microsoft has the most number of regions out of all the cloud providers that are out there. All right, how many VM series? Last one. Warmer. No. Warmer. How many, sorry?
Wow.
Medium or large? Now. Yep, so that's all the series that are available. That excludes the LV2 one that we had up. But yeah, if you've got a workload style that you want, Azure that you can use for it. All right, so that's the question. So the big one for me, if you don't know about it, is hopefully you already do if you're already using it. So Service Bus on-prem from 9th of January, you're effectively out of support. Microsoft's next gen realization of that is please stand up Azure Stack and use Azure Service Bus, which I know didn't make a lot of people very happy, but that's the way they're taking it for the time being. A large take up in things like N-Service Bus and RabbitMQ on-prem as a result of that, but that's probably the key one from a deprecation standpoint. The first half of next year, we'll see the 2 new Australian regions, Central 1 and Central 2, light up in Canberra. They'll be open to everybody to use. They won't just be for government workloads. You'll pay a premium on top of what you pay in AU East and Australia Southeast at the moment, because you're getting a much better level of security and guaranteed throughput and lower latency between those 2 regions because they're the same city, which is unusual for Azure regions. Azure regions are usually minimum 500 Ks apart, but for the purpose of Australia Central 1 and 2, they'll be in the Northern Territory, in the ACT. And the benefit of that is they're connected in things like ICON, which is the big government network, and CDC, who are hosting these, is like a level 2 emergency services organisation. So basically hospitals get services in the event of a natural disaster, followed by CDC. So the chances you'll get a massive service disruption, even with the two regions in the same city, are pretty low. To your questions, hopefully we'll start to see a lot of the missing services that are currently not available in Australia roll out through the first half of next year. So the big one for me is Data Lake, but things like Data Box and even web apps for containers in Australia Southeast, we'll need to hopefully see those roll out. And the bottom line is there's so much demand in Azure at the moment that they're trying to keep up with capacity by provisioning more capacity. So I think the Australian Central 1 and 2 regions are taking a priority for new kit at the moment, so they can get those baselines stood up. But we are seeing additional capacity added across a whole of Azure actually in the US. So this year we saw US West 2 light up, we saw US East 2 light up, we saw US South Central, I think, light up.